Hey lifers, Dustin here. Before we get started, I do want to say real quick, not dead. I am not dead. I missed videos last week because I had some stuff come up in my personal life. I had some traveling to do. The whole election thing was on Tuesday night, the same day that the top 25 was released, and I was up late watching that, and then I just never caught back up, so sorry about that. Won't happen again. Now, when getting back to things that actually matter, the newest top 25 college football playoff committees poll was just released, just announced, and of course I have some thoughts on it. After I talk about their poll a little bit, I'm going to give you my top 25, but considering where we are in the season, I'm really just going to focus on the top 15 of each poll. So without creating a whole lot of fake drama like they do on ESPN, I'm just going to go ahead and get right into it. Of course, number one was undefeated Alabama. Now with all the other undefeateds going down, there's really no wondering about that. As long as they're undefeated, they'll be number one. They'll be in the Peach Bowl. And number two, you have Ohio State. Number three was Ohio State's bestest friend in the whole world in Michigan. And number four was Clemson. You had Louisville coming in at number five and Washington dropping down to number six. Right outside of them, you had Wisconsin and Penn State at 7 and 8. Oklahoma at number 9. And Colorado at number 10. Who would have guessed that? 11 is Oklahoma State, a team led by a man who refuses to admit that they lost to Central Michigan and claims they are now 9 and 1. Okay. At number 12, you have Utah. At number 13, you have a team that Utah beat by the slimmest way possible. Well, that's not true. The way Michigan and Clemson lost is probably the slimmest way. Actually, the way Oklahoma State lost to Central Michigan is the slimmest way possible. But Utah beat USC in a late game touchdown pass. USC is number 13. That was the whole point of all that. At number 14, you have West Virginia, still hanging in there with one loss. One more loss and they are done. And at number 15, you have an Auburn team that lost to a very bad Georgia team and only dropped, I believe, 6 spots? Yeah, 6 spots. So let's talk about, of course, the drama of the day. At number 2, you have Ohio State, who moved up 3 spots. They jumped all 3 of the previously unbeaten teams that lost on Saturday, and that's fine. They are number 2. They beat Oklahoma, which is now number 9. They're now a top 10 team. They beat Wisconsin, which is now a top 10 team. They got beat by Penn State, which is a top 10 team now, while Michigan, who's at number 3, has actually beaten 3 top 10 teams in Colorado, Penn State, and Wisconsin. You could argue that Michigan has the better resume than Ohio State, but Ohio State has been winning more convincingly since the loss. Michigan struggled and lost to an Iowa team that's not great. So Ohio State's loss is better than Michigan's loss. And, of course, at the end of the day, at the end of the season, it won't matter because these two teams play and the winner will eliminate the loser. What I find more interesting is at number 4 and number 5, where you have Clemson over Louisville. And, of course, Louisville fans are going to be very upset. They will point to the fact that that receiver didn't know where the first down marker was, which is whatever. Fight for the first down instead of going out of bounds. And that they beat Florida State by a larger margin, while Clemson fans will point to the fact that, they beat Louisville. They beat Florida State in Tallahassee, something that Louisville did not do. Plus, they have a tougher resume with their non-conference games going and beating Auburn in Auburn, though it was a different Auburn team at the time. They didn't know they could run yet. And they beat a Troy team who's probably going to win the Sun Belt. And I don't know why I'm voice cracked. It's probably going to win the Sun Belt. And I'm really surprised wasn't in these top 25 rankings. I think they should have a shot at that New Year's Six Bowl along with Boise State and Western Michigan. I think they deserve to at least be in the conversation, and not being ranked keeps them from that conversation. At number 6, you have Washington. This just shows that the committee doesn't take the Huskies seriously, that their schedule is not up to snuff as far as the teams ahead of them, and frankly, the teams right behind them, and a poor showing the rest of the way may end up dooming the Huskies, especially if they don't win their conference championship. They are done, and in fact, the Pac-12 may be eliminated altogether. Another really interesting thing to me is who is right behind Washington, You have Wisconsin and Penn State at 7 and 8, kind of sitting there on the outskirts looking in. What's interesting about that is both teams played both Ohio State and Michigan, with Penn State splitting it, of course. But they both have the inside track to win their division, and that may end up being the Big Ten championship game if Ohio State can beat Michigan. Now, if that's the case, the winner of that game will probably be in the playoff. They will probably jump Ohio State in this scenario to get Penn State in there. Or if Wisconsin wins out and then beats either Ohio State or Michigan or Penn State, they will probably be in the playoff. It's going to be very interesting to see how the Big Ten goes. If you are an Ohio State fan, you are desperately hoping that somehow Clemson loses and or Washington. And if you beat Michigan, which of course you want to do, not only because you hate them, but it also helps your resume. You will have beaten 3 top 10 teams at that time. If Penn State wins the Big Ten, but Clemson and or Washington don't win their conference championship or lose another game, you will probably be the beneficiary and get into the playoffs. So that's probably what you're rooting for. Let me know down in the comment section. Other little odds and ends from this top 25 is Utah. That game against Colorado keeps getting bigger and bigger every single week. And speaking of Colorado, USC's win against the Buffaloes now look great. They have a top 10 win, and that was Stanford being ranked at number 23. Even though they lost to the Cardinal, it makes USC look better. Question: what if the Trojans run the table, beat Washington again, or Washington State rather, either one, in a Pac-12 championship game on the road? Do you think about putting USC in the playoff? Like, I know that sounds crazy, but based on the eye test, they're the best team in the Pac-12 right now. I don't know. It's going to be interesting. To circle back around to the Troy conversation one more time, you have Boise State at number 20, Western Michigan at 21. Doesn't matter for the playoff, but it does have huge New Year's Six bowl aspirations. Probably the Cotton Bowl, but it kind of is up for question at this point. But it matters where they're ranked. And to have a one-loss Boise team who's probably ahead of an undefeated Western Michigan team because they have that win against Washington State, who may end up being the freaking Pac-12 champions, which makes Boise look very good. I don't know. I disagree. I think you put the undefeated team ahead. It's not Western Michigan's fault that Boise State played Wyoming. Also, and I need to keep reiterating this, Troy's only loss is to Clemson at home in a game they lost by 6 points. Now, Clemson just lost to Pitt. Penn State also lost to Pitt, by the way. But Clemson just lost to Pitt. It's not as good as if they were undefeated in number 2. That may have gotten Troy in the top 25, but who knows. 3 teams dropped from the top 25 last week, and that is Arkansas, Virginia Tech, and North Carolina. For obvious reasons, they had not great losses. Now, I'm quickly going to give you my top 25, really my top 15, because again, sorry, if you're 18, you don't really factor in the national championship. But if you want to check out both the college football playoff, actually 3, the college football playoff, the Associated Press, and my top 25, they will be down in the description. Make sure to check that out, specifically if you're very curious about who I have between 16 and 25. Now, I have it a little bit more controversial than the college football playoffs top 25. I have Alabama 1, Ohio State 2, Michigan 3, Wisconsin at 4. I think if you barely lose to both Michigan and Ohio State, who are 2 and 3, and you took Ohio State into overtime and Michigan was a 14-7 score, I think that warrants you being right behind them in the rankings, especially since all the other undefeated teams dropped. So I have them ranked higher than Clemson, who I have at 5, Washington, who I have at 6, Louisville, who I have at 7, and the other 2-loss team that's kind of in this mix at Penn State, who I have at 8. I do have Clemson ahead of Louisville because of head-to-head results, and their schedule is way better. I do have Washington ahead of Louisville, and that may change because I realized after, when I was getting ready to do this video, because I did this, I always do my top 25 on Sundays before the AP's even released. I do it Sunday morning around lunchtime, and the AP poll is released at 2 p.m. So I do this before I have any influence. I just do it based on what I think and how I kind of rate teams. Louisville's win over Florida State is better, not only by margin, but also just better than any win Washington can have in the regular season. They lost to USC. It's the last team that they will play that, if they beat them, will impress me anywhere near as much as Louisville beating Florida State, even if Louisville had only done it by a field goal. Now, if they play a one-loss Colorado team in the Pac-12 championship and beat Colorado, that changes things. But right now, just because they may end up being a Pac-12 champion and Louisville will not even win the Atlantic, probably, that doesn't influence me too much, or it shouldn't. But again, I do have Washington ahead of Louisville, and I think that's more me projecting instead of looking at what it is, which is wrong. I have West Virginia at 9 until they inevitably lose and prove me wrong, just like they did when I had them at 5 earlier in the year. I have Oklahoma at 10. Oklahoma has an excellent chance of sweeping the Big 12 and being the Big 12 champ with 2 losses, one of them being to Ohio State, and then you got to start talking about them with the playoff implications. I have Western Michigan at 11 because they're undefeated. They beat 2 Big 10 teams, and it's fun. It's just fun to put them there. I have Oklahoma State at 12. Bedlam is going to be for the Big 12 championship. I think that seems to be clear. Certainly things could happen between now and then, but I personally think Bedlam will be for the Big 12 championship, and if chaos happens, specifically in the Big 10 ahead of them, could be for a playoff spot. And then my last 3 that I'm going to talk about here is 13, I have Utah, 14, I have Washington State, and 15, I have USC. The more I think about it, the more I analyze it, the more I keep wanting to move USC up. Washington State did lose to Eastern Washington, but they lost to Boise State, which doesn't look terrible right now, I guess. Utah's loss to Cal is actually worse than Washington State's loss to Boise State, but it's not as bad as Washington State's loss to Eastern Washington. So I'm kind of torn. I have them grouped together, and they will sort themselves out as the season goes on. So it turns out that the 3 losses from 3 of the top 4 teams, all undefeated, last week is not as deadly and terrifying and terrible as it seemed like, as each individual one was happening on Saturday. Kind of taking a few days off to breathe and relax and really analyze it. And even though I think the playoff committee is not great all the time, one good thing they do is they do come together and seem to analyze it. I think they have questionable placement sometimes, but it is nice to kind of take 2 days off and then evaluate it with a group of other people who kind of can make points you weren't thinking about. So in my return to YouTube after 2 weeks, I definitely want to hear what you guys have to say. You guys have been very lively in the comment section. I would really encourage you to keep going with that, and let me know down below what your top 6 would look like. Now, in getting back to things that actually matter, the newest Top 25 College Football Playoff Committee's poll was just released, just announced, and of course I have some thoughts on it. After I talk about their poll a little bit, I'm going to give you my top 25, but considering where we are in the season, I'm really just going to focus on the top 15 of each poll. So without creating a whole lot of fake drama like they do on ESPN, I'm just going to... Hey Lifers, Dustin here. Before we get started, I do want to say real quick, not dead. I am not dead. I missed videos last week because I had some stuff come up in my personal life. I had some traveling to do. The whole election thing was on Tuesday night, the same day that the top 25 was released, and I was up late watching that, and then I just never caught back up, so sorry about that. Won't happen again. And 1, okay. At number 12, you have Utah. At number 13, you have a team that Utah beat by the slimmest way possible. Well, that's not true. The way Michigan and Clemson lost is probably the slimmest way. Actually, the way Oklahoma State lost to Central Michigan is the slimmest way possible. But Utah beat USC on a late. I'm going to go ahead and get right into it. Of course, number 1 was undefeated Alabama. Now with all the other undefeateds going down, there's really no wondering about that. As long as they're undefeated, they'll be number 1. They'll be in the Peach Bowl. And number 2, you have Ohio State. Number 3 was Ohio State's bestest friend in the whole world in Michigan. And number 4 was Clemson. You had Louisville coming in at number 5 and Washington dropping down to number 6. Right outside of them, you had Wisconsin and Penn State at 7 and 8, Oklahoma at number 9, and Colorado at number 10. Who would have guessed that? 11 is Oklahoma State, a team led by a man who refuses to admit that they lost to Central Michigan and claims they are now 9.